Rome, 44 BC. Julius Caesar is dead. The senators who killed him walked out into the afternoon, with blood still on their hands. They raised their weapons toward the sky. They were waiting for something. Applause. Maybe, or at least some signal from the city that Rome understood what had just been given back to it. The city went quiet. Doors closed. People looked at the men with the bloody blades, and then looked away, not in fear, in confusion, because nobody knew yet what this was supposed to mean. And in a world where everything has just changed, the safest thing is to wait for someone to tell you how to feel. The liberators had a word for what they had done: tyrannicide, the killing of a tyrant. They expected Rome to recognize it. Rome did not recognize it. What Rome recognized was a vacuum. And in the ancient world, vacuums did not stay empty for long. While the senators debated in half-empty rooms, while Cicero wrote letters about the restoration of freedom, while Mark Antony made his first careful moves in the city Caesar had left behind, a letter was traveling east, across the Adriatic, toward a small city on the Albanian coast called Apollonia. An 18-year-old boy was there, studying military theory, waiting for his great-uncle, who had promised him a role in the coming Eastern campaign, living the quiet life of a young Roman with good connections and no particular reason yet to be anyone important. His name was Gaius Octavius. The letter told him Caesar was dead. It told him something else too, something that would have looked, to almost any observer at that moment, less like a gift and more like a problem. Caesar had named him heir, not just to his estate, to his name. The most dangerous name in the Roman world had just landed in the hands of a teenager that nobody was watching. Here is the question this story is really about. Not how Augustus won his wars, not how he outmaneuvered Antony or pacified a world that had been tearing itself apart for a century. The real question is this: how do you build a monarchy while convincing everyone they are still free? Because that is what Augustus did. He held absolute power for 40 years and never once called himself a king. He dismantled the Roman Republic so completely that it never recovered. And he did it while the Senate applauded and the people celebrated, and the greatest poets of the age wrote about the golden era of freedom he had brought to Rome. Caesar used force. Caesar was brilliant and ruthless and almost impossible to stop, and they killed him anyway. In broad daylight, in front of everyone, Augustus used something older and more dangerous than force. He used the willingness of people to believe what they want to believe, and that is a weapon that does not leave marks. Chapter 1. The boy nobody feared. There is a specific kind of advantage that comes from being underestimated, not being ignored, not being overlooked by accident. The advantage that comes when your opponents look directly at you, assess you carefully, and conclude that you are not a threat. That specific conclusion, reached deliberately by intelligent people, is one of the most powerful positions a person can occupy. Gaius Octavius had it from the beginning. He was born in September of 63 BC. His father came from a wealthy family outside Rome, prosperous and locally respected, but without the ancient lineage that separated families who truly ran Rome from families who merely lived in it. His father died when Octavius was 4 years old. His mother, Attila, was Caesar's niece. That connection would eventually become the most important fact of his life, but in the years immediately after his father's death, it was simply a family tie, useful for introductions, not yet a source of anything more. He was a quiet child, serious. He read carefully and retained everything. He was not physically impressive, Throughout his entire life, he would struggle with a body that seemed to resist the demands he placed on it. Chronic illness, a chest that troubled him in cold weather, a constitution so fragile that his survival to 75 years old remains one of the more unlikely facts of Roman history. He compensated the way people with unreliable bodies often compensate. He was precise. He was patient. He thought before he moved. In a world that rewarded men who moved first and thought later, Caesar noticed him. This is worth stopping at, because it is genuinely strange. Caesar had options. He had capable lieutenants with military records, political connections, the kind of presence that Rome rewarded. When the time came to name an heir, he had no shortage of candidates who looked far more suitable than a teenager with a delicate constitution who had never commanded anything. And yet, Caesar watched his great-nephew across family dinners and formal occasions, across the handful of direct interactions that the distance between a world-conquering general and a teenage boy made possible. He arranged for Octavius to accompany him to Spain in 45 BC. The final campaign of the Civil War. Octavius was ill for most of the journey. He made it anyway. Caesar updated his will in September of 45 BC, 7 months before the Ides of March. He named Gaius Octavius as his primary heir. He adopted him posthumously into the Julian family. He left him 3/4 of his estate. Caesar was not a sentimental man. He did not make decisions based on family feeling when the practical stakes were this high. If he chose Octavius, he chose him because he saw something, the most likely answer, the one that the rest of this story confirms, is that Caesar recognized in his quiet, precise, patient great-nephew a quality that was very rare in Rome, the quality of knowing exactly what you are and exactly what you are not, and building your strategy entirely around that knowledge. Caesar himself had never fully possessed that quality. He knew what he was. He sometimes forgot what he was not. That forgetting cost him everything on the 15th of March. Octavius would not make the same mistake. None of this was visible yet in the spring of 44 BC. When the news from Rome arrived in Apollonia, and a young man sat with a letter that was about to change everything, his first decision was not dramatic. He did not make a speech. He did not weep publicly, or rage, or begin issuing orders. He sat with the information. He thought. He talked quietly with the small circle of friends who were studying with him, men who would remain close to him for decades. Then he made his choice. He would go to Rome and claim the inheritance. This sounds obvious. It was not obvious. Caesar's name was not an asset in the spring of 44 BC. It was a target. The men who had killed Caesar were still in Rome, still armed, still convinced that what they had done was righteous. Mark Antony controlled Caesar's papers, Caesar's money, Caesar's political network. Antony was experienced, connected, and had no intention of sharing any of those things with a teenager from Apollonia that nobody had heard of. Every advisor Octavius spoke to counseled caution. He listened carefully to all of them, and then he went to Rome anyway. Not loudly, not with proclamations or dramatic gestures. He crossed the Adriatic, landed in southern Italy, and began moving north. And what happened next was the first indication that something unusual was in play. The veterans found him, not because he summoned them. Word simply traveled. The way word travels through military networks connected by shared experience and shared loyalty, that Caesar's heir was moving through Italy. And they came, men who had fought in Gaul, men who had crossed the Rubicon, Men who had stood at Pharsalus and survived when many of their brothers had not. Old soldiers with land grants and memories, and a loyalty that had not been dissolved by Caesar's death. Because loyalty like that does not dissolve. It simply waits for somewhere to go. They came to Brundisium first, in significant numbers, before Octavius had done anything to deserve them. They surrounded him the way soldiers surround a commander, not formally, not with ceremony, with the casual completeness of men who have decided where they belong. They called him Caesar. He was 18 years old. He had never commanded a military unit. He stood in front of men who had survived things he had only read about, and they looked at him and saw the name, and gave him what the name carried. Now here is the question this moment opens. What did Octavius feel? Standing in Brundisium, surrounded by men twice his age, who were offering him a loyalty he had not yet earned. We do not know. He left no account of it. The people around him recorded what they saw, not what crossed his face in the moment before he composed himself, not what he thought in the hours after the soldiers had been fed and quartered and the noise of the camp had settled. There are two possible answers. One is that he felt the weight of it, that something moved in him when those men called him Caesar for the first time. Some recognition that the name had transferred not just as a legal fact but as a living thing. The other is that he looked at those men and saw a tool, the most powerful tool he had yet been handed, and that the only question worth asking was how to use it. The truth is probably somewhere between them, because the man he would become was capable of both at once, of feeling the weight and calculating the value simultaneously, of being genuinely moved by something while measuring what it was worth. That combination, feeling and strategy in the same moment without either undermining the other, was what made him different from almost everyone he would ever face. The boy nobody feared had just acquired something that Rome's most powerful men did not yet realize they should be afraid of. Not an army, not a name, a decision. He had decided to become exactly what the moment required. And in the gap between what Gaius Octavius actually was and what Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus was going to become, the history of the Western world was about to be written. Chapter 2. A name as a weapon. Mark Antony made a mistake that intelligent people make more often than they should. He looked at Octavius, assessed him accurately, and drew the wrong conclusion. The assessment was correct. Octavius was 18. No military record. No independent political base. No money of his own. Because Caesar's money was currently in accounts that Antony controlled. He was physically unimpressive, frequently ill, and had arrived in Rome with nothing except a legal claim to a dead man's name. Antony saw a problem he could manage. He was wrong. Their first meeting set the tone for everything that followed. Antony received Octavius the way powerful men receive people they do not consider powerful, cordially, with just enough warmth to avoid open hostility and just enough distance to make the hierarchy clear. He acknowledged the inheritance. He did not release Caesar's funds. He explained, with the patient reasonableness of a man who controls the room, that the political situation was complicated, that the money was entangled in various obligations, that these things took time. Octavius listened. He thanked Antony for his time. He left. Then he did something Antony had not anticipated. Caesar's will had promised 75 drachmas to every citizen of Rome. The promise was 2 months old. Nobody had paid it, because the money was frozen and Antony was not moving. Octavius began paying it himself. He borrowed. He sold property. He called in every favor his family network could produce. He scraped together enough to begin making payments, personally and publicly, to the citizens of Rome who had been waiting for what Caesar had promised. He could not afford it. He did it anyway. This was not generosity. This was architecture. He was not buying loyalty with his own money. He was demonstrating that the name Caesar still meant something, that the obligations attached to that name would be honored, even when honoring them was difficult. He was investing in the name itself, building its value at personal cost, because he understood that the name was the only asset he had that Antony could not freeze or confiscate. And simultaneously, without saying a word about it, he was making Antony look like the man who had taken Caesar's money and kept it. He did not need to say that. He just paid Caesar's debts. The contrast did the work. This is the pattern that would define his entire career. He rarely attacked opponents directly. He positioned himself, positioned them, and allowed the gap between the two positions to speak for itself. He did not need accusations. He needed geometry. Cicero understood what he was seeing immediately. Marcus Tullius Cicero was 62 years old in the spring of 44 BC. He had spent his entire adult life defending the Roman Republic with the only weapons he trusted: language and argument, and the persuasive force of a mind that Rome would not see again for centuries. He had watched Caesar accumulate power with mounting horror. Now Caesar was dead, and Cicero believed, with the genuine passion of a man who had wanted something for a very long time, that the Republic could be restored. He needed a weapon against Antony. He looked at Octavius and saw exactly what he needed. He wrote about it privately, in letters to his friend Atticus, with a frankness that he would have been more careful about had he known those letters would survive 2,000 years. He called Octavius useful. He said the young man would need to be praised, honored, and then set aside. He used the Latin word tollendum, which meant to be elevated, but which also carried a secondary meaning, to be disposed of. Cicero intended to use Octavius and then discard him. Octavius knew this. He knew it, and he accepted it, because what Cicero was offering was not friendship. What Cicero was offering was legitimacy. The most respected voice in Rome, the man whose career had been built on defending republican institutions, was about to stand up in the Senate and argue that Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus deserved recognition. That was not something Octavius could buy or manufacture on his own. So he visited the old man with appropriate deference. He listened to lectures about republican virtue with every appearance of sincere interest. He asked questions that allowed Cicero to feel he was educating a young man who genuinely wanted to learn. Cicero stood up in the Senate and delivered the Philippics, 14 speeches, each one a surgical strike against Antony, each one building the case that Antony was a tyrant in the making, a threat to everything Rome had built. They are among the finest speeches in the Latin language. They destroyed Antony's reputation among the senatorial class with a thoroughness that military force could not have matched, and running through all of them, like a thread of gold through dark cloth, was the implicit argument that Octavius was the legitimate alternative. Cicero was writing the story of Octavius for him. He believed he was in control. He believed that the teenager he was elevating would remain manageable, that gratitude without independent power would be sufficient to ensure cooperation once Antony was dealt with. He was the most intelligent man in Rome, and he was completely wrong. Octavius was not learning from Cicero how to be a republican. He was learning how a republican talked, how the language of virtue and tradition and institutional loyalty worked, what it sounded like from the inside, how it moved people who believed in it. He was taking notes. The moment came in October of 43 BC. Octavius had done everything the Senate had asked of him. He had built a military force, legitimized by the Senate at Cicero's urging. He had won engagements against Antony in northern Italy, and now he marched his army to Rome and made a demand, the consulship. Now, at 19 years old, 20 years below the legal minimum age, the Senate refused. He waited. He did not attack. He did not threaten openly. He simply waited with his army outside Rome, while the Senate considered what it meant that the young man they had elevated and armed was standing at their gates with soldiers at his back. They gave him the consulship. Then he did something that separated him from every other ambitious Roman who had ever used military pressure to extract political concessions. He began negotiating with Antony, not because he had defeated Antony, because he had calculated that Cicero's usefulness had reached its limit. The Senate had delivered what Cicero's speeches could deliver. What came next required something Cicero could not provide. The meeting happened on a small island in a river near Bononia in November of 43 BC. 3 men sat down together: Octavius, Antony, a general named Lepidus who controlled legions and would be useful for exactly as long as those legions were needed. They talked for 2 days. What came out of those 2 days was power. Formal, legal, constitutional power, and a list. Antony had names he wanted on that list. One of them was Marcus Tullius Cicero. Octavius agreed. Here is where the story demands that we stop, not to judge, but to sit with what that agreement actually meant. Cicero was not Octavius's enemy. He had done the opposite of harm. He had spent months using every tool at his disposal to build Octavius into a political force capable of standing against Antony. He had believed in the project with a sincerity that his private letters, for all their calculation, cannot entirely conceal. He was also, by November of 43 BC, exactly what Antony said he was: a liability, a voice that would never stop arguing for a republican restoration that Octavius had already decided was not going to happen. A man whose entire moral authority rested on the belief that Octavius was something Octavius was not, and who would eventually understand that he had been used and say so loudly. Antony wanted him dead for personal reasons. Octavius agreed for strategic ones. The question this moment raises is not whether it was right. The question is this: how long does it take a person to reach the point where they can make that decision without their hands shaking? And the more unsettling question underneath it: was there ever a moment when his hands shook at all? We do not know. On December 7th of 43 BC, soldiers caught up with Cicero on a road in Campania, where he was fleeing toward the coast and a ship that was not going to arrive in time. He was 63 years old. He told the men carrying his litter to set it down. He leaned out. He looked at the soldiers who had come to kill him. He told them to do what they had come to do. They cut off his head and his hands, the hands that had written the Philippics. His head and hands were displayed on the rostra in the Roman Forum, the speaker's platform from which he had delivered the greatest speeches in the Latin language. Octavius sent no public message about the death. He did not mourn, and he did not celebrate. He acknowledged what had happened with the controlled neutrality of a man who had already moved on to the next problem. He was 19 years old, and he had just learned something about himself that would shape every decision he made for the next 50 years. He had learned where his limit was. The answer, as far as anyone could tell from the outside, was that he did not appear to have one. Chapter 3. The Art of Surviving Your Allies. Power, in the ancient world, was rarely taken alone. Even Caesar needed Pompey and Crassus before he needed no one. The men who rose highest in Rome understood that the first stage of accumulating power was almost never confrontation. It was coalition. Find the people who want what you want. Build with them until you are strong enough to build alone. Octavius understood this better than anyone who came before him. What separated him from everyone else was that he never forgot what an alliance actually was. A temporary arrangement between people with overlapping interests. Temporary. That word is the entire point. The men who built alliances and then behaved as though those alliances were permanent, as though shared interest would survive the moment when interests diverged. Those men ended up confused and then dead. Octavius watched them and made himself a promise so early in his career that it had become something closer to instinct. He would use every ally he had, and he would never be surprised when the using was finished. The second triumvirate had 3 members. Lepidus was the simplest case. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was a man of considerable family, prestige, and modest personal capability, who had arrived at power largely through proximity to Caesar and the accidents of timing that civil war produces. He controlled legions. That was his contribution. The other 2 accepted it. And from the first meeting near Bononia, it was understood by everyone present, including probably Lepidus himself, that he was the junior partner in an arrangement not designed for junior partners. He was given Africa. He was given the title of Pontifex Maximus. He was kept adjacent to power, without access to the mechanisms that generated it. That was the design. In 36 BC, during the final campaign against Sextus Pompey, Lepidus made the mistake of believing that his legions still made him relevant. He positioned his troops in Sicily in a way that suggested he intended to hold the island regardless of what Octavius wanted. Octavius walked into Lepidus's camp, not with an army, not with an escort designed to intimidate. He walked in alone and spoke directly to Lepidus's soldiers. He appealed to their loyalty, to the memory of Caesar, to the land grants and the future that waited for veterans who backed the right man. He spoke to them the way Caesar had once spoken to mutinous soldiers in Gaul. Lepidus's soldiers switched sides before the afternoon was over. Lepidus fell to his knees in the dirt outside his own tent. Octavius looked at him, made a calculation, and did something that surprised everyone who expected blood. He let him live, not out of mercy. A dead Lepidus was a martyr, a story, something people could organize around, a living Lepidus, stripped of his legions, sent to spend the rest of his days as a ceremonial priest in a quiet Italian town, was something else entirely. He was a lesson. Lepidus survived for another 23 years. He outlived Antony. He outlived Cleopatra. He almost outlived Octavius himself. He died in 12 BC, a very old man in a very quiet house. And Rome noticed his passing the way Rome noticed changes in the weather. Briefly, and then not at all. Octavius had turned a potential rival into a demonstration of what happened to rivals. Without spilling a drop of blood. Antony was harder. Mark Antony was not Lepidus. He was one of the most experienced military commanders of his generation, a man of genuine physical courage and real political intelligence, someone who had been at the center of Roman power since before Octavius was old enough to shave. He controlled the eastern half of the Roman world, with its vast resources and its network of client kingdoms. And he had the loyalty of veteran soldiers who had followed him through campaigns that Octavius had only read about. He was also a man who wanted things immediately. Caesar had wanted things immediately too. It was part of what made him brilliant and part of what killed him. Antony had the same quality, perhaps even more intensely. And without Caesar's compensating genius for seeing 3 moves ahead, Octavius watched Antony the way a patient man watches a fast one. With interest and with time, the triumvirate divided the Roman world the way men divide things when none of them trusts the others. Octavius took the west. Antony took the east. They held the arrangement together with agreements and a marriage. The marriage was Octavia, Octavius's sister. She was recently widowed, the mother of young children. Steady, where her brother was calculating. Warm, where he was controlled. She did not have a choice. Women of her class and connection did not have choices about marriages that served political purposes. She married Antony and bore him children and managed his household in Rome with a competence and a grace that made people love her, which was part of the point. For a few years it worked. Then Antony went east. As Antony always went east. Because the east was where the money and the glory were. And because the east was where Cleopatra was, the marriage to Octavia became a formality. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra became something Rome could not look away from. And Octavius, watching from the west, understood that he did not need to attack Antony directly. He needed to define him. The campaign Octavius conducted against Antony over the following years was not primarily military. It was a campaign of framing. He did not attack Antony as a political rival. He presented Antony as a Roman who had been corrupted by the East, a man who had abandoned Roman values for a foreign queen, a man whose loyalties had drifted so far from Rome that he could no longer be considered Roman at all. He obtained Antony's will from the custody of the Vestal Virgins and read it publicly in the Senate. The violation of a private document held in sacred trust was a serious breach of Roman custom. Octavius acknowledged this and read the will anyway. The will apparently confirmed that Antony intended to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra, and made provisions for their children that suggested loyalties more Eastern than Roman. Whether the will said exactly what Octavius reported is a question the evidence cannot resolve. What is beyond dispute is the effect. Rome was angry, not at Octavius for reading it, at Antony for writing it. Then Octavius did something that revealed exactly how clearly he understood the difference between a civil war and a foreign one. He declared war on Cleopatra, not on Antony, on Cleopatra. This precision was not an accident. A civil war was something Rome was exhausted by. A foreign war was something Rome understood as the natural activity of a republic defending itself. By making Cleopatra the enemy, he transformed the conflict from a power struggle between two Romans into a defense of Roman civilization against an Eastern threat. Every soldier who crossed the sea with him was not fighting for Octavius against Antony. He was fighting for Rome against Egypt. The story was complete. The war could begin. At Actium in 31 BC, Antony's forces collapsed with a completeness that still surprises historians who study the campaign. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. The end was visible from any reasonable vantage point. Octavius arrived in Egypt with the careful speed that was his signature. Antony died by his own hand, as Roman generals were supposed to die when they had lost beyond recovery. He had been told, falsely, that Cleopatra was already dead. He fell on his sword. Cleopatra was still alive. Octavius met with her. He wanted her alive. He had a triumph planned. The formal military parade in which a victorious Roman general displayed the spoils of his campaign to Rome. Vercingetorix had walked in chains in Caesar's triumph. Cleopatra would walk in chains in his. She understood exactly what he wanted. She looked at Octavius across whatever room they met in. She understood what waiting meant. She chose differently. the asp, or the poison, or whatever mechanism she used, which the ancient sources debate without resolution, was her final act of refusal. The one thing in the entire story that Octavius had planned for and could not prevent. He had written a role for her, as he had written roles for everyone, and she declined to play it. She was the only person in this story who escaped the script he wrote for them. He buried her with Antony in Alexandria, as she had apparently requested. He displayed her image in the triumph instead, a wax figure of the queen, with the asp at her arm. It was not what he had planned. He made it work. He always made it work. Now Lepidus was composting quietly in a country house. Antony and Cleopatra were dead in Alexandria. The legions of the East were transferring their loyalty to the man who had defeated their general. Octavius stood alone in a position that Rome had not seen since the earliest kings. He controlled everything. The question was, what to do with everything? In a city that had just spent a century tearing itself apart over whether one man should control anything at all, he was 32 years old. He went home to think. Chapter 4. The greatest performance in Roman history. January 27 BC. The Senate of Rome is assembled in full session. The war is over. The last enemy is dead. The legions are loyal. Every province from Spain to Syria answers to one man. And that man is sitting in this room. And everyone in this room knows it. Octavius stands up to speak. He announces that he is giving it all back. The provinces, the armies, the emergency powers accumulated across 17 years of civil war. All of it. Returned to the Senate and the people of Rome, freely and without condition, because the crisis that had required such extraordinary measures was now resolved. He sits down, the room goes quiet. Then, honor be done. They begin to speak. Senators rise to argue that this cannot be permitted, that Rome still needs leadership, that the situation remains too fragile for a return to the old ways, that the man who has just offered to give everything back is precisely the man who should be asked to keep it. They vote. They give it back to him. They also give him something new, a name, not an office, not a title with defined legal powers. Avord, Augustus, from the Latin augere, to increase, to honor, to make great. The word had religious connotations, associations with sacred authority and divine sanction. It had never been used as a personal name before. It would occupy a category of its own, somewhere between a title and an identity, somewhere between what a man was called and what a man was. Gaius Octavius accepted it with the appropriate expression of humble gratitude, and from that day forward, for the remaining 40 years of his life, and for 2,000 years of history after that, he would be known as Augustus. Now step back from the ceremony and look at what actually happened in that room. The senators believed they had participated in a genuine deliberation. They had considered the situation, weighed the arguments, and reached an independent conclusion that the extraordinary leader who had restored peace to Rome should be asked to continue. None of it was accidental. The renunciation, the senatorial alarm, the restoration, the name, all of it had been prepared with the meticulous attention to staging that Augustus applied to everything that mattered. The senators who rose to argue against his resignation were not spontaneously moved. They had been spoken to. The arguments had been considered in advance. The outcome had been shaped before the session began, the way theatrical productions are shaped before the audience arrives. Augustus had not seized power. He had arranged for power to be pressed upon him by the legitimate representatives of the Roman state, who believed they were acting freely, because he had created conditions in which freely acting was indistinguishable from acting as he intended. This is the entire distance between what Caesar did and what Augustus did. Caesar took power. The taking was visible. The Rubicon. The consulship forced at sword point. The dictator perpetuo. Each step was real, and each step was seen, and each step gave his enemies something specific to oppose. Augustus arranged for power to be given. The difference sounds cosmetic. It was not cosmetic. It was the entire structure of everything that followed. Consider what it means for the Senate to give power rather than watch it be taken. A Senate that gives is a Senate that still believes itself to be a meaningful institution. Its members can tell themselves, and mean it, that they are participants in the governance of Rome rather than ornaments on someone else's throne. That belief, even when it is technically false, is worth an enormous amount. It creates cooperation. It creates investment. It creates men who will defend the arrangement because they understand themselves to be part of it. Caesar's senators conspired against him in the corridors of his own power, because his power was visibly his, and they were visibly excluded from it. Augustus's senators administered his empire for him, because they believed the empire was theirs too. The system he built had a name, eventually. The Principate. From princeps, first citizen, not king, not dictator, first among equals in a republic of free men. The title carried no formal legal powers. It described a position, not an office. It suggested priority without claiming supremacy. It was a word a man could use to describe himself in a room full of senators, and have every senator nod in recognition. Because the word was old and familiar, and did not sound like what it actually was. What it actually was a monarchy. Not a monarchy in the Eastern sense. A Roman monarchy, something that looked like the Republic from every angle Romans had been trained to look from, and functioned like absolute rule from every angle that actually mattered. The armies were his. The treasury was divided in a way that shifted toward his control as the empire expanded. He held the power of tribunician authority permanently, making himself inviolable and capable of vetoing anything. He held proconsular authority across the entire empire, superseding any provincial governor whenever he chose. None of these powers, taken individually, was unprecedented. What had no precedent was one man holding all of them simultaneously, permanently, packaged in the language of republican virtue. With the enthusiastic cooperation of the Senate, he had distributed power across so many supporting structures that no single point of failure could bring the whole thing down. And he had disguised the load-bearing elements so thoroughly that most of the people living inside the structure could not identify which walls were holding the ceiling up. He dressed simply. He ate modest meals. He lived in a house on the Palatine that was, by the standards of Rome's wealthiest citizens, restrained. He stood when the Vestal Virgins entered a room. He called himself the servant of the Senate and the Roman people, a phrase he used with a regularity that suggests he understood the value of repetition. He never wore a crown. For 40 years he maintained this performance with a consistency that is almost more impressive than the political genius that designed it. Almost, because image and reality, held together long enough, become the same thing. And that was the point. Chapter 5. The Empire of Meaning. In 27 BC, the same year the Senate gave Augustus his name, a poet in Rome was working on something that would outlast every army Augustus ever commanded. His name was Virgil. He had been working on the poem for 11 years. He would work on it for 6 more, and he would die before he considered it finished. And his dying wish was that the manuscript be destroyed because it was not ready. Augustus overruled the dying wish and published it anyway. The poem was the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas. The Trojan hero, who survived the fall of Troy, came to Italy and founded the line that would eventually produce Rome itself, a foundation myth for a civilization, written at the moment when one man was redesigning that civilization from the ground up, running through the entire poem, like a golden thread, was a prophecy. The gods have ordained a destiny for Rome. A descendant of Aeneas will arise to end the age of wars and bring peace and justice to the world. The poem did not name him. It did not need to. Every reader in Rome knew exactly who the prophecy described. Now here is the important thing. Augustus had not told Virgil what to write. He had not commissioned a flattering portrait of himself disguised as an epic poem. He had not handed Virgil a list of approved themes and required conclusions. He had done something more subtle and more powerful than that. He had created conditions. He had created a Rome in which the greatest poets and historians of the age found genuine meaning in the project of Augustan restoration, in which rebuilding Roman culture after a century of civil war felt like the most important artistic task available, in which the values Augustus publicly claimed to represent, peace, tradition, family, Roman virtue, were values that serious artists could sincerely explore without feeling that they were serving power. Whether they were serving power was a different question. This is what separates what Augustus built from ordinary propaganda. Propaganda tells people what to think. It operates through repetition and pressure. It works, but it produces a specific kind of compliance. The compliance of people who have stopped arguing rather than people who have been persuaded. What Augustus built was harder to resist and harder to name. He built consent, not manufactured consent, not the crude engineering of opinion through false information, but something more sophisticated. He built a Rome in which the story he told about Rome was true enough, in enough of the ways that mattered to enough of the people who needed to believe it. That believing it was not a betrayal of intelligence. The civil wars had been real. The exhaustion was real. The desire for peace was genuine. When Augustus pointed to the closed doors of the Temple of Janus, the ancient Roman symbol of active war, and noted that they had been closed only twice in 7 centuries, and that he had closed them 3 times. The peace that fact represented was a real achievement. The marble was real. The aqueducts brought real water. The grain supply fed real people. The question was never whether Augustus had done good things. The question was the one that nobody was quite able to ask directly, in a city where certain questions were no longer entirely safe. Was this the only way? The poets did not ask that question, or if they did not publish the answer. Horace wrote about the pleasures of wine and friendship and the Italian countryside with a contentment that feels, reading it 2,000 years later, genuine. He also wrote odes celebrating Augustus that are careful and accomplished and slightly impersonal, in the way that a man writes in a register he has chosen rather than one that came naturally. The contentment and the celebration coexist in his work without apparent tension. The tension was there. It was simply managed. Virgil is more complicated. The Aeneid is a poem about destiny and sacrifice and the cost of founding something great. On close reading, it is not an uncomplicated celebration of Augustan Rome. Aeneas does terrible things in the service of his destiny. He abandoned Dido, the queen, who loves him, because his fate requires it, and she kills herself. And the poem does not pretend this was without cost. In the final lines, Aeneas kills his defeated enemy, not in cold calculation but in a rage, a loss of the controlled virtue the poem has been celebrating. And the poem ends there, on that moment of rage. Without resolution, Virgil spent 11 years on the poem and wanted it destroyed. We cannot know everything that was in that dying request, but the poem Augustus saved and published contains, in its most careful reading, questions about whether the price of Roman greatness was worth paying, questions the surface of the poem does not ask, questions the dying poet may have intended to leave unanswered. Augustus published it anyway. Either he did not see those questions, which seems unlikely for a man of his intelligence, or he saw them and calculated that the poem's usefulness outweighed whatever complications lived in its depths. The second answer is more consistent with everything else we know about him. Then there was Ovid, the most talented poet of his generation, younger than Virgil and Horace, born into the Augustan peace rather than the civil wars that had preceded it. He wrote with a wit and a sensuality and a formal brilliance that made him the most popular poet in Rome during his lifetime, and he wrote about the wrong things. His ars amatoria, the art of love, was a witty instructional poem on the techniques of seduction, light, funny, and, in the Rome of Augustus's moral reform program, a direct public disagreement with the official project of restoring Roman sexual virtue. Augustus had spent years legislating that virtue. He had positioned himself as the guardian of Roman family values, the restorer of the moral seriousness that the Republic had possessed in its great days. Ovid wrote a witty guide to adultery and dedicated it to the people of Rome. For 8 years, nothing happened. In 8 AD, Augustus moved. Ovid was exiled to Tomis, a small city on the Black Sea coast, at the very edge of the Roman world, cold, remote, as far from Rome as it was possible to be sent without leaving the empire entirely. He spent the remaining 9 years of his life there, writing poetry, begging for recall. He was never recalled. What had Ovid done? Exactly. The poem was 8 years old when the punishment came. The timing suggests something else had happened, possibly connected to a scandal involving Augustus's granddaughter Julia, who was exiled the same year. The specifics are lost to time, but the principle was clear. There were limits. The limits were not written in any law that Ovid could have read and understood and chosen to comply with. They were implied, felt, known by everyone in the way that certain rules are known, not through explicit statement, but through the accumulated evidence of what happened to people who transgressed them. Explicit limits create explicit resistance. Implied limits create self-censorship, which is more thorough and more durable and produces fewer martyrs. Augustus did not destroy Ovid. He sent him to the edge of the world and left him there as an example of exactly the right size, visible enough to be instructive, not large enough to be a cause. He was building the room in which they would think, and he never stopped building it. The Forum of Augustus opened in 2 BC, anchored by the Temple of Mars the Avenger. It was lined with statues of Roman heroes, a hall of fame in stone, every figure selected and arranged to tell a specific story about Roman history as a progressive revelation of Roman greatness, culminating in the present moment. Hundreds of thousands of people moved through it each year, each of them absorbed, through the arrangement of marble and the positioning of statues and the inscriptions below each figure, a version of Roman history that placed Augustus at its natural conclusion. He was not teaching them what to think. He was building the room in which they would think, and in that room, the question of whether any of this was a republic or a monarchy had no comfortable place to land. That was the design. Chapter 6. The man inside the performance. There is a version of Augustus that history finds easy to write: the strategist, the architect of empire, the man who learned from Caesar's mistakes and corrected them, who understood that power openly held is power openly threatened, and that the only durable authority is the kind people do not recognize as authority at all. That version is true. It is also incomplete, because the question at the center of this story is not only how Augustus built what he built, it is what it cost to be the person who built it. And that question leads, eventually and unavoidably, to a room where a woman was not allowed to leave. Her name was Julia. She was his only child, born in 39 BC on the same day, according to some sources, that Augustus divorced her mother. Scribonia had served her purpose. The marriage had been a political arrangement, and political arrangements ended when they stopped serving political purposes. Scribonia went. Julia stayed. She was raised in her father's house under conditions the ancient sources describe consistently. She learned to spin and weave, because Augustus believed Roman women should know the traditional domestic arts, and he applied that belief to his own household with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything else. She was educated, because Augustus valued intelligence and could see that she had it. She was also supervised in a way that went beyond the normal watchfulness of a Roman father over a marriageable daughter. She was not permitted to meet men her father had not approved. She was not permitted to go anywhere he had not sanctioned. Augustus loved her. The evidence for this is consistent across sources that have no particular reason to agree with each other. He educated her himself in the early years. He worried about her health with a visibility that people who knew him remarked upon, because Augustus did not usually allow his worries to become visible. He kept her letters after she was grown. He kept them for years. He also married her 3 times for political purposes, beginning when she was 14 years old. The first husband was Marcellus, his nephew, the young man he had been quietly positioning as his successor. Marcellus died in 23 BC. Julia was a widow at 17. The second husband was Agrippa. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa was the general who actually won most of Augustus's battles. Actium was his tactical victory. The campaigns that secured the Western Empire were his campaigns. He was 15 years older than Julia, the same age as her father, and he had been married to someone else when Augustus asked him to divorce his existing wife and marry Julia instead. Agrippa complied. He always complied. Julia and Agrippa had 5 children in 8 years. Augustus adopted the 2 boys, Gaius and Lucius, as his own heirs. He had found a use for the marriage beyond alliance. Agrippa died in 12 BC. Julia was 27 years old, a widow for the second time, and her father was already identifying the third husband, Tiberius, her stepbrother, already married to a woman he was genuinely attached to. Augustus required him to divorce her and marry Julia instead. Tiberius complied. The marriage was miserable from the beginning. They were poorly matched in every way that mattered, and neither of them had chosen the arrangement. Tiberius eventually withdrew to Rhodes, officially on a kind of voluntary retirement, but effectively in exile from a situation he could not endure. Julia was left in Rome. What happened in Rome between 6 BC and 2 BC is not fully recoverable from the evidence that survives. What is recoverable is the official version. Julia had committed adultery with multiple men. The evidence was presented to Augustus in a way he found impossible to explain away. He exiled his daughter to Pandateria, a small island off the western coast of Italy. He wrote a letter to the Senate explaining what she had done. He cut off her supply of wine. He forbade male visitors. And then he did not recall her, not when popular sentiment turned in her favor and crowds began calling for her return. Not when years had passed and the political urgency of whatever had happened had receded into history. He moved her eventually to the Italian mainland, a slight relaxation rather than a genuine restoration of freedom. She remained there. She never returned to Rome. She never saw her father again. She outlived him by 1 year, dying in 14 AD, possibly having been cut off from financial support after his death. He did not name her in his will. Now, consider what this story means when placed against everything else we know about Augustus. This is the man who spent 40 years publicly defending Roman family values, who legislated against adultery with a severity that sent Roman nobles scrambling to review their personal lives, who positioned himself as the restorer of Roman domestic virtue. This is also the man who divorced his first wife on the day his daughter was born, who married that daughter 3 times to men chosen entirely for political utility, who left her in Rome while her third husband retreated to an island rather than remain in her company. He had created conditions. That phrase has appeared before in this story. He created conditions in which talented people found meaning in serving the system. He created conditions in which the desired outcome became the natural outcome. He had done the same thing to his daughter. He had created conditions in which Julia's life was so thoroughly organized around his needs that whatever she did in the spaces he did not fully control was, in some measure, a response to the completeness of the control everywhere else. The question this raises is not comfortable. Did Augustus ever understand the connection? Whether he ever sat in his modest house on the Palatine, in his homespun wool, with Julia's letters in a box somewhere nearby, and understood that what he had done to his daughter was not separate from what he had done to Rome. Both were managed, both were controlled, both were shaped by his needs rather than their own. Both were given forms of apparent freedom that turned out, at the edges, to have very firm walls. He loved her. He kept her letters. He did not let her come home. These 3 things coexist in the record without resolution. No amount of analysis closes the distance between them. There is one more thread here. On the 19th day of August in 14 AD, Augustus died in a small town called Nola, south of Rome, at the age of 75. He had been traveling with Tiberius. He felt unwell near Nola and stopped. He did not recover. His last day is recorded by Suetonius, who was born close enough to the events to have spoken with people who were present. He spent the day with Tiberius. Talking at length about matters, Suetonius says, were private. He asked for a mirror and had his hair combed. He said goodbye to the friends who had been summoned. He asked them, in Greek, whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and requested their applause, in the traditional manner of the Roman theatre. Then he told Livia to remember their marriage and live well. And he died. The performance ended. The question he asked at the end, whether he had played his part well, is the question this chapter has been circling without being able to answer. Because the answer depends on what you think the performance was for. If it was for Rome, the answer is almost certainly yes. He gave Rome 40 years of peace after a century of civil war. He gave it the structures that would sustain an empire for 5 centuries after his death. If it was for himself, the answer is harder, because somewhere inside the performance was a person who kept his daughter's letters and did not recall her? Who chose Tiberius when he wanted someone else? Who spent 40 years being Augustus and may have forgotten, somewhere along the way, what it felt like to be Octavius? Or perhaps the performance and the performer had never been separate things. Perhaps what Caesar had seen in his quiet great-nephew, across family dinners and formal occasions, was not the capacity to become Augustus. Perhaps it was simply that Octavius had always been this. We have the marble, we have the poetry, we have the 40 years of peace and the empire that lasted 5 centuries. We have a box of letters from a daughter he loved and would not recall, and we have a question he asked with his last breath. In Greek, to the people in the room who had known him longest. Did I play my part well? He did not answer it himself. He left that, like almost everything else in his life, to the audience. Chapter 7. The Price of Peace, Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It began with Augustus and lasted, in the form he designed, for approximately 2 centuries. The period from his death to the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD is called by historians the era of the 5 good emperors, which captures something real about a stretch of time in which the empire was administered by a succession of capable men who maintained what Augustus had built. 2 centuries in which the Mediterranean world experienced a degree of stability and prosperity it would not see again for more than 1,000 years. Roads that connected Spain to Syria, a common legal system that provided consistent protections across dozens of provinces, a single framework of administration that allowed a merchant in Alexandria to conduct business in Rome without an interpreter. These things were real. The people who lived inside them experienced them as real. Augustus built the architecture of that world. The question was never whether he had done good things. The question was what the good things cost. The first cost was institutional. When Augustus died, the Senate met to discuss the transition of power with the solemnity appropriate to a republic deciding its own future. They debated. They deliberated. They eventually asked Tiberius to assume the powers that Augustus had held. The debate was real, in the sense that the words spoken were real, words spoken by real men. It was not real in any other sense. There was no genuine alternative. The armies were loyal to the Julian name. The treasury was controlled by the apparatus Augustus had built. The entire machinery of Roman governance had been reshaped over 40 years into something that required a single controlling intelligence at its center. The senators who deliberated knew this. Tiberius knew this. The deliberation happened anyway, because the deliberation was part of the system, part of the performance of republican continuity that had to be maintained even when the outcome was not in question. Tacitus, writing a century after the events, described the scene with the bitter precision of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. The senators, he wrote, rushed to servitude. They competed with each other in the extravagance of their flattery. This was the republic Augustus had restored. The second cost was Teutoburg. In the autumn of 9 AD, 3 Roman legions entered a forest in what is now northwestern Germany. They were under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, a governor better suited to administering a pacified province than fighting a mobile enemy in unfamiliar terrain. The enemy was not unfamiliar with the terrain. Arminius was a Germanic chieftain who had spent years in the Roman military, risen to the rank of equestrian, earned Roman citizenship, and learned everything about how Roman armies fought. He had eaten at Varus's table. He had been planning the ambush for years. The 3 legions, approximately 20,000 men with their auxiliaries and camp followers, entered the forest in a column that stretched for miles through terrain that compressed them, slowed them, separated them from each other, and from any ability to form the battle lines that Roman infantry required. Arminius attacked from the trees. The battle lasted 3 days. By the end of the 3rd day, the 3 legions were gone, not defeated, not routed, gone. The standards were taken. The officers were dead or captured. Varus had fallen on his own sword. The news reached Rome with the speed that catastrophic news always travels. Augustus was not composed about it. He let his beard grow, which Romans did in periods of mourning. He was heard, repeatedly, in the months that followed, calling out across empty rooms and empty corridors, "Varus, give me back my legions." The man who had spent 40 years never letting his public face show anything he had not decided to show. The man who had managed the deaths of allies, the exile of his daughter, the accumulated costs of building an empire, with a controlled neutrality that his contemporaries found almost inhuman. That man walked through his house and called out for his dead soldiers and could not stop. This is the crack in the marble. This is the moment when Gaius Octavius came through. Briefly and unmistakably. Through the 40 years of Augustus that had been placed on top of him, he did not call out for the Senate he had hollowed out. He did not call out for the republic he had preserved in name and dissolved in substance. He called out for the soldiers, the men who had done what he asked and died for it in a German forest. The grief was real and specific, and he could not manage it. Augustus halted Roman expansion east of the Rhine permanently after Teutoburg. The frontier was pulled back and held there. The world map was different because of those 3 days in a German forest. Because one man could not absorb the loss of the men he had sent there. The third cost was the future. The system Augustus built was extraordinarily successful at doing what it was designed to do. But the system had a flaw written into its very design. It depended, at its center, on the quality of the person occupying the center. Augustus had spent 40 years as that person, shaping and managing and refining the role with the intelligence and discipline it required. He had built a system that needed someone exactly like Augustus to function as intended. He had not built a system that could survive without one. After Tiberius came Caligula. After Caligula came Claudius. After Claudius came Nero. What Caligula demonstrated was that Augustus had built a system that could be run by a monster as easily as by a genius. Because the system did not depend on the quality of the person at its center. It depended on the loyalty of armies and the cooperation of administrators and the inertia of institutions that continued functioning regardless of who was nominally in charge. The brilliance and the flaw were the same thing, seen from different angles. He had given Rome the best version of one-man rule that one man's intelligence and 40 years of careful management could produce. He had not solved the problem of what comes after. Tacitus wrote the most honest sentence that Roman literature ever produced about the Augustan settlement. He did not write that Augustus was a tyrant. He did not write that Augustus was a savior. He wrote that reasonable men disagreed. That some pointed to the peace and said the price was worth it. That others pointed to the Republic and said nothing justified that loss, and that the truth lived somewhere in the dispute itself, inaccessible to anyone who had already decided which side they were on. He turned all eyes toward himself. That is how Tacitus described it. And in a world where all eyes are turned toward one man, everything depends on that man. Augustus was the right man. He was not going to live forever, and he had built a system that depended on him as if he were. Look at a calendar. Find the month of August. That name belongs to a man who died on the 19th day of that month in 14 AD. At the age of 75, in a small town south of Rome called Nola. His name is in your calendar. His calendar is your calendar. The months of July and August sit next to each other in every year. Two men who were enemies, carved permanently into the structure of time itself. Unable to escape each other, even across 2,000 years, the word Caesar traveled. Kaiser, the German title for emperor, a direct phonetic descent from Caesar, carried into the Germanic languages through centuries of contact with Rome. Tsar, the Russian word for sovereign, from Caesar through the Byzantine Greek Kaiser, transmitted through the Orthodox civilization that Rome's eastern successor state carried into the Slavic world. The last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, was executed by Bolsheviks in July of 1918. 1,962 years after Julius Caesar was born in the Subura district of Rome, the title was still in use. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453 and ended the Byzantine Empire after more than 1,000 years of continuous existence, he took the title Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome, a Turkish sultan, ruling an Islamic empire from a city that had been Greek for 1,000 years, claimed the title of Caesar of Rome as a legitimate inheritance of authority. The word had traveled that far. Now return to the question, how do you build a monarchy while convincing everyone they are still free? The answer, after everything we have seen, is this: you do not convince them of anything. You build conditions in which believing they are free is more comfortable than examining whether they are. You give them peace after war, marble after brick, poetry after chaos, grain after hunger. You give them forms they recognize and traditions they were raised to respect, and the daily experience of a world that is not actively trying to kill them. You call yourself the first citizen, and dress simply, and sit in the curule chair, and stand when the Vestals enter the room. You make freedom feel like what they already have, and then you make yourself so essential to the experience of that freedom, so embedded in the structures that deliver it, so identified with the peace, that the alternative to you is the thing they remember from before you, which was a century of civil war and proscription lists and 23 stab wounds on the floor of a Senate meeting hall. That is the answer. Caesar gave Rome a clear choice: power or republic. He chose power, and they killed him. Augustus gave Rome no choice at all. He gave them a world in which the choice had already been made, quietly and completely, and without a single moment that could be pointed to as the moment it happened. And he surrounded that made choice with enough marble and enough poetry and enough peace that the absence of the choice felt, from the inside, like the thing that freedom feels like. He was 18 years old when he read the letter in Apollonia. He was 75 when he died in Nola, asking whether he had played his part well. In between, he built the world, not the world he wanted. Exactly. The world that was possible, given what he had inherited and what he was capable of, and what the people around him needed and feared and were willing to accept. It was enough to last 5 centuries. It was enough to shape 20 more. It is enough, still, that the month in your calendar carries his name, that the pattern of power he invented runs through systems of governance that would not recognize themselves in him, that the question he answered in 27 BC is the question that every concentrated power since has had to answer, whether it knows his name or not. How do you make people accept power they did not choose? Give them something they actually want, then make yourself the thing that gives it to them. Augustus, the first citizen, the man who found Rome in chaos and left it in marble, and called the whole thing a republic, He would have been satisfied with that summary. He always preferred the version that left certain questions unanswered.